I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the Senior Director for the Europe Center here at the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted to be introducing today a conversation on the French presidential election that was held yesterday in France, that Emmanuel Macron won with a decisive 58%, re-elected for a 5-year term against Marine Le Pen, who was already his opponent in 2017. We'll be joined by a terrific panel of experts to first decipher the results of the election and look at next steps. What does that mean for France, a country that, like the United States and many of its European partners, is divided, bitterly divided today? What are the next steps with the parliamentary elections coming next month? And what does that mean for Europe at a time of war on the European continent and ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine? What does that mean for France's position and leadership within the European Union? And of course, what does that mean for the transatlantic relationship? A lot of topics that will be discussed by our terrific panel today. We're really delighted to be joined in studio in Washington, D.C. by Sandro Gozzi, member of the European Parliament, the Secretary General of the European Democratic Party, and a member of President Macron's party at the European Parliament, Renew Europe. He's sitting next to Marie Jourdain, our visiting fellow from the French Ministry of Defense here at the Atlantic Council. And we'll be joined on Zoom by Charles Litchfield, the Deputy Director of our Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council, who also happens to be a very well-informed nerd about French politics and everything France related. And this conversation will be moderated by our friend Ryan Heath, Senior EU Correspondent at Politico, of course. With this, Ryan, let me turn it to you.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you everyone for joining us for this great event. Sandra, I might kick it off with you as the elected representative that is joining us for this session. Now, a re-elected President Macron is obviously what you and everyone else in Brussels wanted. But for millions of French, their experience of the EU is as remote or indifferent to their lives. Macron is also criticized by many for being out of touch with the struggles of the sort of people who went and voted for Marine Le Pen. We know those criticisms are often leveled at politicians from establishment backgrounds in Washington as well. So my question to you is, what does Macron now need to do to reconnect with those voters, to connect the EU to those voters, and to connect his movement, your movement, to those voters, the rural French, the 25 to 30-year-olds, the working families who went for Le Pen this time around?
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, by the way, to the Atlantic Council, and thank you, Ryan, for your question. I would like to stress 3 points. The first point is the issue of legitimacy. I think that Emmanuel Macron is the most legitimate to try to move ahead with the European agenda, also in France, because he has never hidden that Europe is at the heart of his political project. I mean, on Europe, he won the election in 2017, and he clearly said that this election, especially in the second round, was a sort of European, a French referendum on Europe. So from this perspective, first, I think he's got the democratic legitimacy to move ahead with this agenda. The second point is that Europe is more and more at the center of national debates. And this is another tool, it's another opportunity to try to persuade the part of the voters who opted for Marine Le Pen, and that part of the voter who opted not to opt, because you got certainly 41% of votes in favor of Marine Le Pen, but you got also 26% of French citizens who abstain. So what do we have to do? I think that he must focus on 3 key points, and I will end up my answer here. First of all, the ecological transition. It is clear that if you want to reconnect with youth who opted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon in the first round, He has to put the ecological agenda at the center of the governmental action, and this is what he announced. He said that his new prime minister will be the prime minister of the ecological planning. He wants to appoint 2 ministers in the front line, on ecological issues and on territorial and ecological issues. That it is certainly something very important. The second issue is to tackle social inequalities. I mean, I think that the social results of Emmanuel Macron in his first mandate are positive. After all, especially the youth unemployment has never been so low in France in the last 40 years, but it's clear that because of the pandemic, because of the current economic crisis, there are growing inequalities. So to focus about territorial cohesion, to focus about social cohesion is going to be very, very important. And then to promote also, health and education policy, school policy. I think that if he does so within a European context, with a strong democratic legitimacy to work on Europe as it's got, I think that he must give the answer you're asking me.
And a quick follow-up question. What else does he need to do to engage with the Le Pen voters? And what I mean by that is that they're not represented really in Parliament. And I'm not saying that that won't change in the parliamentary elections, but you have 42% of people who maybe aren't fully reflected in the existing institutions. Is there something else that Macron needs to do about how he assembles coalitions of support for each of these programs that you've laid out? Something about the method, not just the what of the policy.
Yeah, there are two things to answer to your question. The first thing is the method, and the third thing are the reforms. The method will change. Because, compared to 2017, it's like 1 century ago. In these 5 years, we got the yellow vest crisis, and that was already the push to change the method. Then we had the pandemic crisis and the Ukrainian crisis. So the method will be a method of dialogue, more horizontal approach, dialogue with organized civil societies, dialogue with social partners. The reform will continue, but they will be accompanied by a much deeper and intensive dialogue. And this is something that is very important, and it will happen. It is a clear commitment we took, and a new method is necessary because we are in a new political and societal phase. The other issue is the reform, because after all, what you mentioned is the issue of the representation of the French society in the parliament. He has announced the will to set up a transpartisan committee to discuss about how to improve the function of the French institutional and political system, including modification of the electoral law. I think that this is also a very important commitment to be inclusive, to be open to dialogue also, and to listen also to those voters who, as you said, either voted for Marine Le Pen in the second round, or they voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon who abstained. I think that these two approaches can be very helpful in filling this gap.
Thank you, Sandro. Marie, if we could change tack and focus on your specialism for a few minutes. NATO was one of the clear points of tension in the election, where Marine Le Pen, I think many Americans know, wanted to withdraw from the integrated command structure, basically the old de Gaulle policy. And Macron had famously called the alliance brain dead. And we've seen everything move into a different gear as a result of Russia's latest invasion of Ukraine. So I guess my question to you is, what can Macron do now to shore up support for those alliances and France's role in these international institutions? Because it will remain a point of skepticism for Marine Le Pen when she comes back and tries to win the Élysée again in 5 years' time.
Yeah, thank you for this great question. When Macron said NATO was brain dead, it was in a very particular context. It was under the previous Trump administration. It was also because NATO was struggling about the purpose. And there was a debate afterward leading to the work that is ongoing on the strategic concept that should be out at the end of June with a summit in Madrid. And so Macron has never been on the same approach than Marine Le Pen. Is not. He's never been against NATO. Is actually want to make Europe stronger within NATO. And it's been very obvious with the Ukrainian war that his commitment within NATO is stronger than ever, with France committing actually forces in Romania. And so in that regard, he really wants to move forward, both hand in hand, should I say, with the EU and NATO to make Europeans stronger on the defense side. Then you also have to take into account that NATO is not necessarily well understood, the purpose, the history, what it meant, what it ensured in terms of security for the French people. And so there's also, I think, work to be done here to provide a better understanding for the French citizens to understand what NATO is and can deliver.
I wonder, adjacent to NATO, but really maybe in a whole other part of the world, France has been really keen to develop its Indo-Pacific strategy and engagement in recent years. And we all know the debacle with the submarines in Australia and the US. I don't mean to revisit that in detail now, but I wonder if you see any extra role that Macron could play in the Indo-Pacific, either in terms of countering China as a way to repair some of that relationship and the bridges that were burned last year over the submarines.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, basically, it's important to remind that the EU also adopted an Indo-Pacific strategy, and the US administration also published very recently its own Indo-Pacific strategy. And to be fair, it's critical to see that in the Indo-Pacific you have many challenges. You have military ones, but you also it's much more larger than this. And so NATO can play a role, and already like he's looking more in depth about the Chinese challenge. Is it a threat to actually the European continent, because the Atlantic Alliance, is only focused on the Atlantic space, but it also means that the EU and NATO could work better together to tackle the Indo-Pacific challenge. They're also with the partners of the region for sure, but there's still a lot to work upon about what NATO roles can be in the Indo-Pacific, and what the US and the EU can achieve together better, also with the partners in the Indo-Pacific, because their approaches actually have more in common than they differ.
Thank you. Now, Charles, I want to bring you in on the domestic and economic front now for a few minutes. There will definitely be a chance to talk more about EU and global coordination, and I think that is obviously a big part of Macron's program. But we also know from opinion polling that many French voters, like large majorities, have been quite upset about cost of living issues and the pressures that they've been under. It's not to say that that is Macron's fault, but there's clearly a gap between what French people are feeling and what he's been able to deliver on those issues. And so I wanted to sort of tease through some of the policy implications of that, or what you think some of the politics might be. So the first question really is, how can he bridge this gap, this expectation gap with the voters, without simply resorting to more and more state spending, which seemed to be the Le Pen approach?
Well, thanks, Ryan. Impossible question. Inflation is always a very difficult issue for governments to deal with, because there is a perception issue. And also when you're dealing with expectations on prices, the moment the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's quite hard to get the process, to stop. Macron's response before the election was, of course, to increase public spending as well. When energy prices started rising long before the war in Ukraine, the French government decided to send €100 checks to low-income households. So essentially, I think with the election in mind, they already did increase public spending, and it was already at a very high level. it's a difficult question for the French government in a sense because inflation is actually quite low in France. It's lower than anywhere else in the Eurozone. It's much lower than the average. This is in part thanks to the government's protections on prices. It's also thanks to decisions French governments have made over the years on France's energy mix, which has protected French households a bit more than others. And yet there is this perception of absolutely a big bet that was taken a long time ago on nuclear power generation. The government can try to sort of be pedagogical on this. That's what Macron tried to do in his debate with Mrs. Le Pen. Tried to say that her measures were irresponsible, whereas his were temporary. Her response was that she wanted a sort of a long-term solution to the cost of living crisis, and the way he sort of tried to pick at that was just through technical detail. It is hard to see how the government will deal with this issue or remove a sort of perception of high cost of living in the near future. That perception will remain. The government can try to point at inflation being higher elsewhere, but I'm not sure that will really work. I think it's just going to remain an issue that will be a thorn in the side for this government.
Yeah, I might, in a minute, I'll come back to get everyone's reaction on that, because it feels like it's moving into very much the identity zone rather than the policy fix zone. And for anyone who wasn't aware of some of these polling breakdowns, so just before the election, we don't know that it's 100% correct, but you can assume that this is mostly correct. By about 2-to-1 margins, Macron was winning the support of professional, i.e. white-collar workers, and Le Pen was winning by almost the exact reverse margin, 2-to-1, the blue-collar or less educationally qualified workers. And I was blown away when I saw those numbers. But I've got a more specific question, Charles, for you. And it's around how France can become greener in the way that Macron says he wants, while also engaging with Le Pen voters without resorting to naked protectionism. Is there any special needle threading that can be done there? Or are we just going to see some more protectionism as a way to shore up that sort of democratic front?
I think I'd be a bit more optimistic in this second answer. I think there is more the government can do simply in coordinating what different parts of the government is doing. And it's interesting that the Prime Minister will have this planning role. So the ecological commitments will be part of the Prime Minister's title, and they will try to bring in more joined up thinking, which is a cliche, but I think France could really do more of that in terms of where things are produced, in terms of using the energy mix more efficiently, in terms of making clever investments now. I think that could be done better, and not necessarily in a way that makes France more protectionist, but just in a way that is better organized, a better organized approach. I don't think Le Pen voters are necessarily completely indifferent to the climate, the problems to climate change. If you look at polls on what French concerns are, it usually ranks quite high, perhaps not quite as high as in other European countries. And I mean, maybe on average, the Le Pen voter is slightly less concerned. But if you were to, any government, I think, would be punished at this point for ignoring it. So it isn't necessarily a wedge issue. And I think the government can simply reorganize its approach. We're trying to avoid talking about the European aspect because you're keeping it for later. But the French government is obviously a very big proponent of doing these things in a European way. Europe has made very strong commitments. We'll come back to them later. I did notice in the speculation on the prime ministerial role, Macron said not only will the prime minister be able to coordinate, but they're also they made it a bit of a race in that France will be the first great industrial nation no longer to depend on fossil fuels. So trying to sort of be better than everyone else, which I suppose is another way of getting public opinion behind you, in that if France does it before everyone else, you can be a bit proud of that.
Well, I take the hint. Let's bring the European dimension in, and each of you feel free to respond to the comments you've already heard. It shouldn't all just be flowing from me. But I guess my sort of nudge on the European side of things is that you can get more done if you do it at a European level sometimes. You also end up with lowest common denominator results, and they can take longer. And your domestic politics could become beholden to whatever comes out of the EU sausage-making machine. Sandro, you are the EU sausage-making machine. So why don't you tell us what the rest of the EU's responsibility is to Macron to help democracy stay functioning in France, and where you think the two levels of government can better interact over these next 5 years?
I think that the difference between Emmanuel Macron and his predecessors is that Emmanuel Macron knows that and embodies this perspective, knows that France, as other countries, badly needs Europe, and that you cannot you cannot propose and promote a program of change, a program of reform, without putting that in the context of the European Union. And the difference that Emmanuel Macron has said it explicitly, and they say explicitly also in his, communication, electoral communication. I mean, a stronger France, an independent France in a stronger Europe. The courage in a country where the state tradition is so rooted as France to merge the notion of national independence with the notion of European power, I think that is probably one of the most brave and the longest-sighted act of Emmanuel Macron. And he's right that in the fact that, I mean, you can provide concrete solutions for your country in many cases only if you develop new strategy at European level. The objective that you mentioned to make of France, to transform France into the first carbon neutral country in Europe. It is clear that, I mean, it is something that you cannot reach without also the European Green Deal, for example. And this is why Emmanuel Macron has been so pushing on the Green Deal, and why we sausage makers, as you mentioned, Ryan, we are so keen in promoting the Green Deal and the full implementation of this huge legislative and political package of more than 50 proposals. Now the challenge, it would be my last point, is to explain to those blue collars voters of Marine Le Pen why for them also to become the first carbon neutral country is a good news. That's the point. And probably on that, we have to do a much better work, because to set a target is certainly a challenge, is certainly, a way of making things happen, but you have to explain why, what does it change? And it changes a lot. What does it change for the blue collars? What does it change for people in the heart of Auvergne? The fact that we, in France, we want to become the most performing country in this sector. This is the job that we have to do, in my view, in this new phase.
Does that mean things like a carbon border tax? And so by that, I mean, Sarkozy raised it even years ago, so it's not a new idea, but the idea that you tax environmental goods or goods that have a footprint higher than what would be the case in Europe, as a way to either force those producers from outside Europe to do better, or as an incentive for manufacturers to produce them in Europe, where there are already high standards. Is that something you could sell to a Le Pen voter as
Absolutely.
a way to build jobs?
Absolutely, and this is why it is a very good news that under the French presidency we had, as you know, as you wrote also, the first political agreement on this. This is very important. This is very important because it's a way of pushing the green agenda. It's a way to ensure ecological justice, also to promote the competitiveness of the European enterprises, and to push also our partners outside Europe to really engage on the Paris Agreement agenda. So certainly this is something which not only is useful, but can also be presented and sold as a good solution for those part of the electorate, of the voters you're referring to.
Murray, I wonder your views on whether the EU will be an easier thing, an institution, a concept to sell to skeptical French voters if it had some more hard power, the harder edges that are starting to come very slowly by investing in collective defense and research around armed forces, the EU being involved in the hybrid threats like cyber and so on. Will building up the EU at that level make it easier for French voters to understand why there needs to be investment in the EU, do you think?
That's a tough one.
All the hard ones today, sorry.
I think, like you mentioned, the work of explaining what the EU can do, can achieve, and why it's in the interest of the French voters, whoever they are and whatever they vote for, will be critical. Making the EU stronger, for instance, in terms of security, if I just take an example, for instance, the Macron project for the past 5 years and will continue to implement is to have a more unified defense industry within Europe. And what does that mean? It's also that the taxes that the European taxpayers are paying for must create European jobs in the defense industry. And so it's also part of it is like the EU can deliver on security, can it be on like within NATO, like we mentioned earlier, but also like on hybrid, on cyber, on resilience, etc. And sometimes you also need the defense industry to actually have the capabilities. You need to do that. And in that regard, if you also have the jobs, that will be easier sell for the politicians. And so we have seen with the war in Ukraine that in many European countries, the strong decisions of the leaders to increase the defense spending in defense. But European voters are also very much concerned about their own security, but also, like we mentioned, social justice, the environment, etc. So every effort will also have to be paid by the taxpayer at some point, and so they need to see the result of this, and so it goes through explanation, but also go through actual benefits for the citizens.
Charles, I'm going to continue my tough questions, and it's around jobs. Sandra reminded me that Joe Biden focuses very much on the jobs aspect of the green transition as a way to make it palatable to his domestic audience. And it feels like when you look at those numbers among the 25 to 34-year-olds and how they essentially went nearly 60% for Le Pen, it feels to me like even if youth unemployment numbers are low, there must be something about the quality of the jobs and the salary of the jobs and how that connects back to cost of living. And I would not want to be embarking on building a family or trying to buy a home if I was only getting 1,500 euros or $1,700 a month in my pocket, which is what some of these young people are facing. But Macron is also very realistic about his role in the economy. Like he said it in the debate, like I don't set salaries, I don't make jobs, private enterprise does. So what do you think he could do there to build up better quality jobs in France to tackle some of that anger that we were feeling in this election?
Yeah, I mean, I think partly you can sort of, if you put yourself in Macron's shoes, he would probably take a longer view and is probably reasonably optimistic about the reforms and the decisions that were taken a few years ago. Even, and I love to remind people of this, under his predecessor, who already took some liberalizing decisions about the labor markets. We're starting to see more long-term contracts created than short-term contracts. And you could see this as a positive sign that over the next 5 years, those jobs, the fact that long-term contracts are being created says something about the overall quality of these jobs. People want to stay in them. The fact that the companies are willing to invest or take a risk on someone means that they might invest a bit more in the development of their skills. One part of this campaign that did come up quite a lot was continuous education. Obviously, it didn't come up as much as the cost of living and the war in Ukraine. But it was part of a recent reform that the government was able to present. Sadly, sometimes it became a bit trivial because people keep receiving these phone calls from brokers trying to offer them ways to spend their funds on continuous education. But the government's point would be that these programs are just getting started. They've already produced some embryonic but promising results, and hopefully over the next 5 years, you would see the fruits of what's being done. I'd also say about this category is really very interesting. The 25 to 34 year old category that did swing to Mrs. Le Pen. If you ask that age group about essential issues like EU membership and even the green transition, they're actually still interested. So you're right, this is a sort of stage in people's lives when things are becoming a bit difficult, you're perhaps a bit less optimistic, you're starting to realize that perhaps you're not living as well as your parents did at the same age. But at the same time, they were voting for Mrs. Le Pen because she was running a more moderate campaign than last time, and then a lot of them abstained as well. So that would be perhaps why a simplistic reading of the result, not that I'm accusing anyone of simplistic readings, would suggest perhaps that they don't believe that these policies will produce results, but the government would say wait and see.
Maybe I wanted to open it up now a bit more and throw a general question open to each of you. It seemed from Macron's acceptance speech or victory speech last night that he was recognizing that many people voted for him, not for him, but to stop Marine Le Pen. And that brings a responsibility now, not just to do reforms in his own image or on his own program basis, but to starve Marine Le Pen of political oxygen. And I wonder what you think he might try to do, or what you would advise him to do if he was sitting there today in the Elysee. I don't know. Charles, we'll start with you and mix it up.
You broke up, sadly.
I'm sorry. How do we starve Marine Le Pen of political oxygen? What's your advice to Macron?
Well, to some extent, she has problems of her own, which I think Macron will enjoy just watching, observing, and the far right and the many families that we now see on the far right are bitterly divided, hate each other. There's been all sorts of treason over this campaign. It's been kind of interesting to watch, and they face this huge dilemma in that most people who sympathize with the far right sort of accept that Mrs. Le Pen will never win because of the family heritage, and because even though she prepared very hard for this debate, you could still see at some stages that she wasn't up to scratch technically. But she has the 41% of the votes, and her challengers on the far right, though they think they're much cleverer than her and have the right ideas and are more true to the conservative values of the far right, they have 7% or even less. So that in itself means that while yesterday's result was alarming in some ways, that in itself means that Macron can sort of sit back and watch this unfold, and it won't necessarily unfold in a way that's too easy for the far right. And that would be my answer. I'll leave it to the others to think of what Macron can actively do.
Before I invite you other guys to speak, I'll throw out there as a devil's advocate that the trajectory of the Le Pen dynasty, family, however you want to call it, she doubled the vote share of her father going back 20 years. She herself did 8% better than last time. That does not equal 50 or 51% in 5 years' time, but the trajectory is not downwards. And it is somewhat of a durable coalition, whereas Macron's movement and party is very new. The other parties that he's drawn upon have collapsed. We don't know what's going to be there from the center and Macron in 5 years' time. So on that happy note, Sandro and Murray, how would you starve Marine Le Pen of political oxygen?
Okay, no, many things. I will try to be brief, but I mean, you put a lot of things on the table, rightly so. Well, first of all, according to the poll which was out today, 57% of the people who voted for Macron voted for Macron. 43% of the people who voted for Macron in the second round voted more to stop the extreme right. And that is certainly something on which he has to work. It's good news that 57 voted because they adhere to his political project and because they approve is the result, the outcome of his first mandate. But certainly we have to work on that 43. I give you a political answer and a more social answer. The political answer is that we will have to pursue the work to enlarge the presidential majority. After all, this is in the very nature of Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron is not an accident of history. And those who say that it was an accident of history in 2017 are proven to be wrong. Macron interprets a new politics and a new political system. And from this perspective, we will have to enlarge the presidential majority, looking at the left and looking at the right, because there is a new political cleavage around which not only French politics, but in general European politics and probably beyond is organizing, which is between pro-European policies and nationalistic policies, open society approach and protectionism, I would say values protectionism, identity politics and universal values. And this is why Marine Le Pen, even the Le Pen family has already lost 8 elections, because if you put together Jean-Marie and Marine, they lost 8 times. But today the world has changed. And today, not only in France, but a little bit everywhere in Europe, you got extreme right, nationalist, populistic movement, which embody this new cleavage. And so it is clear that, and now I come to the economic and social answer, it is clear that to fight this, you have really to focus, I repeat myself, but I'm strongly convinced that you have to focus on two issues. The issue of social inequalities, that is fundamental issue. And it is not only an issue of economic growth, but it's an issue of opportunities, an issue of effective school and education system, an issue of giving hope to those who have lost any hope. And the other issues to bring on your side youth is really to be even more convincing, more effective, and more intensive in the fight against climate change and ecological transition. I'm convinced that these two societal answers, together with the political work to further enlarge the presidential majority, can be the answer to your very difficult question.
And if I may, just like my 2 cents to complement on what have been said, when you look at who are Le Pen voters and Macron voters, it's very obvious that the Le Pen voters are actually the ones who are less hopeful in the future. And so it also means that they don't find in the Republican projects or like in the parties, traditional parties, the answer they're looking for. And so there is also a lot to dwell upon. I think it's a bit too soon to draw conclusions already on what should be done, but this is just to put there in the debate. The second point is also to look at where they are, and they are mainly in the countryside. And so there's a difference between the French citizens about like if you live in the cities or if you live in the countryside, and if you live in regions where you've got high employment and others. And so it's just to complement, because it also means that the preoccupations they have are different. Like if you have a job that is well paid, you have your home and everything, maybe you can focus more on the war in Ukraine and what it means for your own democracy, and maybe you want to focus on this issue because you feel that the future of Europe is at stake. But if you if you don't know how you will feed your children at the end of the month, or it will be much more harder to listen these arguments. And so it's also about reconcile this very fractured society that is also new in France.
Thank you, thank you. We've got time for one more question, and I guess it's a general one to each of you as well. Back in 2017, Macron's Republic En Marche swept the parliamentary elections. You couldn't control more power if you tried by democratic means. It was a great success. I don't expect it's going to be fully repeated this time round, but I would love each of your perspectives on what we can expect from this new government that Macron will appoint and the legislative group that he'll have to deal with, and whether we can expect the traditional parties to get on the board and finally win something like they did not in this presidential vote. Mari, I'll stick with you and go to Charles and give the final word to Sandra.
I think a lot depends on the result of the parliamentary elections, and as mentioned earlier, about who will be prime minister and the composition of the government. The left, for instance, is actually consulting at the moment about being in the opposition or being able actually to engage with the new government to achieve results on issues that they agree on. And so this majority will be different for sure. But it's still a bit early on, as the prime minister has not been designated. You don't have a government. You need the parliamentary elections. So I would be quite cautious on this one.
Fair enough. Charles, what's your input?
Before Macron's re-election, I think most people, the consensus was that he'd be re-elected, but that he'd struggled to win a parliamentary majority. Why? Because his party doesn't really exist without him, doesn't have much of an identity. Once people have felt he's been re-elected by default, facing Mrs. Le Pen, surely they're not going to give him full reign through the parliamentary elections. But I'm starting to revise my view on that. And there was a poll published today which has supported this change of mind. I think many people are changing their minds, in fact. This poll suggested that Macron would have a workable majority, but by compromising and negotiating beforehand with compatible forces on what was formerly the centre-right and what's left of the centre-left, although most of what was on the centre-left and is compatible with Macron is already subsumed and absorbed in his En Marche party. There have been negotiations going on already with the centre-right that is loyal to Macron's former Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe. Obviously, Macron has a long-standing alliance with what used to be a centrist party under Mr. Bayrou. But they've managed to do this discreetly and without even announcing who these candidates are and what the spread is going to be. This poll, obviously, has the momentum of yesterday's results, suggests that he can make it. I think it is true that Marie was saying that what happens on the left is very important. I think that's absolutely true. The left does feel wind in its sails because of Mélenchon's better than expected result, and perhaps a feeling that had they been that bit more coordinated, they could have made it into the second round. So they want to catch up over the parliamentary elections. And Macron does feel that that is where the danger is, not so much on the right, which is divided and basically everyone hates each other. So on the left, there is a feeling that there might be a bit more cooperation. He needs to make sure that that flank is defended. And so his choice of prime minister, I think, will be informed by that.
Sandro,
well,
what's the inside word? What have you been hearing on your mobile phone line overnight?
No, one point. I mean, the legislative elections are the election where the French voters must decide which kind of government they want, and they must decide whether they want to provide a majority to the president they just elected. It is not the revanche like Mélenchon or Le Pen think. It's not the third round, you know. I mean, well, we lost the first two, but we are going to win the third. This is not, in my view, the attitude of the French voters. So I think that Macron can have a presidential majority. It is going to be very tough because France is cut into 4 pieces: the presidential majority, the extreme right, the extreme left, and the abstention. And all these 4 pieces are going to play a very important role in the legislative elections. The presidential majority is going to organize itself. It is clear that there will be common candidate of the presidential majority everywhere. And it is also clear that this work that Macron has started in 2017 and is doing now will continue. What is this work? To overcome the traditional cleavages and to expand the presidential majorities toward the right and toward the left. This is going to happen during the elections, but probably it could happen also after the elections to ensure that there is a solid majority. It is clear that, I mean, this is also in line with this new approach. I want to be more horizontal, less vertical, less Jupiter, and more team player. And it is clear that this involves also an open discussion, not only with the trade union and civic forces, but also with other political forces. So I think that this is going to be the key point to follow in the next weeks. But I am confident then it can win a solid majority in the National Assembly.
A great note to end on. We began talking about the new Macron method. We've ended on it as well. I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. I want to thank you, Sandro, Marie, Charles, and wherever you are in the world, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you back again soon for another event at the Atlantic Council.